Hello world! You are watching Angular Air. My name is Kent C. Dodds, and I am joined by two special guests. First, Pascal Precht. I should have asked you, how do you say your last name, Pascal? How do you say your last name?
It's Precht.
Oh man.
Yeah, you can do it.
So yeah, that's Pascal. And then Chirayu Krishnappa.
Yes, hi.
Awesome. And Pascal has done a lot of work on his library called Angular Translate. It's like honestly de facto standard for i18n in Angular apps. And then Chirayu's done a lot of work, and I believe Pascal's done some work on Angular 1.4 and internationalization in the framework itself. And so we're going to be talking about internationalization today. We're pretty stoked to have them here. So just a couple of announcements before we get started. Next week's show is going to be April 7th, so we're doing weekly shows again. I'm actually going to be in the middle of Philly Emerging Tech in Philadelphia, which will be fun, so I'll have to find like a closet somewhere to do this show. But we're going to do it next week with Paul and Roderick about contributing to the Angular framework. So if you've ever been wanting to see a change happen or make a change, this would be a great show that we want you to watch. And then, as always, follow us on Twitter and Google Plus to know the shows that are upcoming, and remember to ask us questions. Right now, for this show, we don't have any questions, and so you are able to submit questions until the end of our show, and so be sure to get on there to submit any questions that you have, and we'll look before the end of our show. So, without any further ado, let's go ahead and get ourselves started. So, we say i18n. What does i18n mean, and why do we care about that? Either one of you guys can answer any of these.
So maybe I just start on that one. So i18n is basically a sort of acronym for internationalization, which is a sort of like process to make your application available in different languages, for example. And so Chirayu and me, we gave a talk on that topic at NGConf this year, and there we also explained that there's much more involved than just translating application messages from one language to another. So you need to think about how do you get your messages out of your application, how do you hand them over to your translator, and when you get them back, how do you get them back into your application? And so there's a whole like process around it, and a lot of different subtopics that you need to consider. Yeah.
Do you have any comments, Chirayu, about that?
Basically, what Pascal said, it's basically that, right? So one analogy I've used for myself, and I don't know how it helps other people, is to think of things like when you started having your products available across the world, one of the things people needed to do was also adopt Unicode. And it was very simple when your applications were all ASCII because you could treat byte streams the same as, say, text. You didn't have to distinguish. And internationalization, the two parts that like Pascal mentioned. So internationalization is like saying, I'm going to make my code Unicode safe, right? It's not Unicode safe, but it's structuring your application in such a way where you distinguish what needs to be translated and what doesn't, in a way where it doesn't take too much effort, so that when you do want to say, I want a French version of my application, that part is then going to be easy because it's been structured. Like for instance, the same analogy as Unicode or something, right? Like if your application had a distinction between text and bytes, which were like actually supposed to be bytes, then you only had to deal with text being Unicode, and everything just magically works. But if your libraries mix them up, then it's a problem. And it's the same with internationalization. If you structure your application in a nice way, then when you want to localize it, you can use some tools which can understand all this stuff and make the job super easy. And that's a thing called localization. Maybe that's like L10N or something.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, we're full of acronyms.
Yeah, so I think that's actually an important distinction, localization and internationalization. So can you talk to that a little bit more? What falls under the umbrella of localization, and what's different with internationalization?
Right. So internationalization is really really the process of making it easy to localize your application. So making it possible that your application is actually localizable. So that's at least part of it. So, like, for example, when you use something like Angular Translate, maybe we're going to talk about that one later. For example, you start replacing all of your concrete text messages in your application with translation IDs. So they're like a sort of abstraction, right? And this is like the internationalization part, like making your application internationalizable, and then you localize it with concrete translations, later at runtime.
Okay, that makes sense. We did talk about this a little bit, but I just like, do you guys know of any, and I didn't ask you this before, but do you know of any statistics about why developers should care about internationalization? Like what percent of, well, I don't know. Like maybe the point that I'm trying to get at here is like, why does it matter to me as a developer that people of other people who speak other languages or who have different formats for numbers, like why do I care that my stuff is consumable by them?
I don't know, like Pascal's probably going to follow up on this, but I can like give you my 2 cents on it. And as a developer, it depends on where you're developing. For instance, if you develop at Google, you don't have a choice, because if you want to launch a product, you're supposed to have it like upwards of 40 countries, right? You had to support on launch day upwards of 40 countries typically. Like it doesn't mean that everything has to work. For instance, like the Play Store may not work outside the US on its very first day of launch, but it should still be internationalized and stuff like that. And if you're not working at scale, even then it turns out that you want to have things be internationalizable, not because you want to support a different locale today, but that you want to support it sometime in the future, and it doesn't take you that much effort to do that today. Like if you follow those practices, you don't take yourself into a corner. And it's even simple things. For instance, recently we were just going to run a birthday party, and in the car we were talking about stuff. One of the things is I prefer my dates to European style, it turns out. I did not know it was a European style. But I want to have the year first, and then the month, and then the day. So in every UI, I configure my preferences to do that. And somebody else may want to have your local thing. Even though I'm in the US, I'm choosing a different style, right? And you want to allow your application to do these things. And for structuring your application to enable this is kind of similar to structuring it to enable it for internationalization. You kind of will solve both, as opposed to not thinking about it. And then when you do have to go change this or support this in your application, it's a much larger effort because you had to go find every possible place you could tweak in any of these things. Pascal has way more to say about this.
Well, so what I can say from my experience is at some point you just might build an application that just needs to be available in different languages and different regions. So there's just no other way. And at that point you just need to find a solution to do that. And it turns out that there are actually a lot of people out there who need that kind of functionality, whatever solution they use. There are a lot of use cases out there where you need different languages in your application, because there are a lot of people out there who just don't understand German or maybe even English, right? So yeah.
I think that's reasonable enough, we are in the process of internationalizing our app at work, and like it's heavy lifting if you haven't built it like structured it so that it's international. And it's a lot of monkey work too. It's really frustrating when you're taking something that's just all plain text in English and making codes for it, and yeah, it's a pain. Like setting up the architecture to make it work, that's not crazy hard, especially with something like Angular Translate. But then going through and finding all the places in your app where you're feeding text to the user, like that is painful.
Right. I had exactly the same thing when I was back in the days when I was in my apprenticeship. They had a sort of backend solution for that. So you also had things that are called translation IDs, so the like sort of message IDs. And so I was the one who needed to go through all the templates and replace all those texts in the templates with translation IDs. And it's not that I had a list of translation IDs that I can use. I had to come up with all of them myself. So it's really a hard process to name those things. So you start with things like, I don't know, like form label text, or like in capital letters, and then with underscores, capital underscore, like form label text or form label name text or whatever. So, and then at some point, you have a use case where you also have a form label text, but it's a different kind of thing. So you need to come up with another translation ID, and these are very horrible to write and horrible to read, and you have to invent them. And yeah, it was very it was monkey work.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been a bit of a pain, but it's going to be great when it's all done. And big thanks to Angular Translate. So one question that I thought of while Chirayu was talking was, how do you, what's a good way to detect or how do you handle user preferences for their language preferences? How do you know what language to serve to them?
Oh, so Angular Translate already comes with a lot of support for this, and the way I look at it personally is that it's a bunch of, it's sort of orthogonal to the other process of internationalizing your application. So this is the thing to say, how do I figure out what currency format I want to use or what locale I want to use, right? And there's a lot of support that needs to happen once you know what locale it is, but figuring out the locale is sort of custom. We want to have like default solutions, and Angular Translate has default solutions with Pascal and Chirayu like soon after that. But the idea is you could use GeoIP, you could use something else. But if I'm a logged in user, if I'm a Gmail user from the US and I travel to Germany and I log into Gmail, once I'm logged in, I don't want to see German because it should already know who I am. So if it has to pull the locale out of the user preferences object, then something in the database has to record. Like if Gmail doesn't record the fact that I'm English speaking, then it's going to use GeoIP or something else, right? So that's key. You'll have a few out of the box, but at the same time, the application has to configure the service or something and say, I want to override this now or not, or is he logged in or not logged in? So there's a few strategies there. Like GeoIP is one of them, but logged in or not is one. If you have custom domains, and it depends on the service, some of them switch away, some of them do. If you go google.jp versus google.com, you get, like, by default, if you're not logged in, you're going to get the thing based upon that domain. Sometimes people redirect. So if you go to google.com in Japan, it'll redirect you to google.jp. But if you go to google.fr or something, it's probably not going to redirect. It's going to assume you meant .fr. And that's a Google-specific rule, right? So it'll be like a company or application-specific rule. Because .com is considered like the take me to the right thing domain, but .fr isn't. If you went to .fr, you really meant to see French, that kind of thing. And those are heuristics. And that's kind of in the realm of the application to configure. You have defaults, but you had to pick.
No, that's very interesting.
Yeah, so that's also how I think about it. So there are some way to find out what locale your user has, but it's a bit unreliable. For example, you can use there are some properties on the browser object, on the window object in the browser, something like window.navigator.something, where you can find out what is the current locale of the browser that your user has. But they're implemented differently across browsers, so this is something that you can't always use. So I think in the end it always boils down to something like you somehow decide what the preferred language of your application is, so you just configure it, sort of hard-code it. But at some point you might want to override it, for example, with a user setting or something, so that if you have an application where a user can log in or something, there might be a setting where you can actually configure, okay, so I want to use this language or that language, and that's something that you store somewhere, either in local storage or maybe somewhere on the backend side in a database or whatever. And so your application should then be able to read that stuff and then set the locale accordingly.
Awesome. Yeah, that was sort of a selfish question because I'm working on solving this for my app right now. So got some good ideas I'm thinking about. The thing that I landed on was I discovered that navigator property is totally unreliable. If, like, for example, I changed my my language preferences in Chrome, and then the navigator still showed that my preferred language is English, even though I set it to French. And so, like, your only recourse really is to make a request and then have the server send you back the accepted language, which you sent to the server in the first place, which is like so weird. I wish that the browser would just open up an API for that, but yeah, it's a little bit of a challenge, I think, but it's a challenge worth overcoming. So.
Right. On that topic, since you mentioned the Chrome thing, what I do know, and it touches on the .com domain name kind of thing, right? What happens is, in the past, everything, well, a large majority of it, not everything, happened to be like English specific. So browsers and a bunch of others tend to think like, if you pick US English as your default, it doesn't actually mean US English. It means we don't know who you are actually. Because
Oh, really?
it's French, like you really meant French. But since English was the default all the time, we don't know if you're a French person because the browser just defaulted and you never configured it, or if it's really English. So it's the same with the .com domains, which redirect you to country-specific TLDs because we don't know. Like that used to be the only domain at some point, and there's a bit of that. But I also mentioned earlier that like being logged in helped, and you had user preferences. But that's one side of it because you don't always want to have somebody logged in just to get their locale. So if you have a locale selector and you select it, like what Pascal was mentioning, he mentioned like local storage, that's a great thing, either session storage or local storage, right? Like you store it there. And it's sort of like how on, say, you go to Google.com or like Bing.com or whatever, and you say, yeah, show me, don't moderate my search results. To pick that flag, you don't have to be logged in. It's kind of remembered because using session storage and local storage. And the language dropdown should do the same thing. If you modified it in your user preferences, yes, you're updating it forever or like storing the final version. But if you just picked it, until you clear your cookies or something, you shouldn't have to keep setting it every time you go to the web page.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good strategy. I think I'm going to do that. That's helpful. Because that's another thing is I went to Sweden and Amsterdam, and I don't speak Swedish or Dutch, and so it's nice to be able to, even in those other countries, when you detect, okay, you're in this country, you probably speak this. It's nice to be able to give those overrides. And local storage is, I think, a good solution if you're not having users log in, or even if you are, like on the login screen, you can choose. So. Yeah, I think it's just the overall idea, and why developers should care about this is you want to let your users have their choice on how they consume your content, so that they can do so most efficiently, most enjoyably. Yeah, it's all about caring about your users.
Yeah, and there's a little bit of a thing, anecdote sort of to speak, right? Because before I joined Google, like 2006, I worked at a startup which did some social networking stuff. So we only cared about the US market because we were a very small startup. But it turned out that our user base in China was like 20 times the size, or maybe even 100 times the size. We don't know. Like there were a lot of Chinese users. We just appeared not to care because we didn't understand Chinese. We were not going to monetize it. Our goals, because we had Series A and Series B, and we were like, we want to exit at some point. That wasn't in our plan. But at the same time, we didn't want to completely abandon them and say until like this thing hits, like we don't care. So we ended up like having a messages.json or something, a file where people could take in their own translations for these things, and they could side load it with a query parameter saying a question mark, I forget what we use, like lang file equals or something. And if we did that, like it would just override the UI to something. And the thing is, the community kind of maintained it. We didn't know Chinese, and we weren't hiring professional translators. And we were not going to maintain it week to week based on updates. But like the users were happy. If 80% of it is auto-translated, since they already were using it in English, they were happy. So it's going with that caring for your user. And also, if you weren't like the startup or something, right? Like if you don't know where your users are going to come from, which may be more common in Europe, where there's more languages and a similar economy, you don't want to lock yourself into one language or locale. like see where your growth is and then go there, right? Maybe.
Yeah, that's very interesting strategy. Get your users to help because they want to use your stuff, and people want to help other people. So that's cool. Cool. I think that's really good information. So let's get into Angular Translate, and then after we talk about what Angular Translate does for Angular developers today, I want to talk about what Angular 1.4 does for developers tomorrow. So first, Pascal, do you want to give us a little backstory on what Angular Translate is, where it came from, and what it does?
Sure, sure. So it started, I think, 2.5 years ago or something, when I was working for a company. So it was an agency, and I had to build a Angular application, and we used it from pretty much the beginning on. And so I built this application, and so we needed to bake this application as hybrid app with PhoneGap, so it was not an online application. And it turned out that this application needed to be baked in 2 different languages. So we needed a solution to take the existing code base that we have and bake it in 2 different languages without duplicating the code. So I thought about it and I said, yeah, okay, I can do it. And so the first thing I did was, so I've built this Angular filter, and it's just called the translate filter. And all it does is it takes a translation ID, which is just a string, right? And so it takes a string, and then it looks this string up in a translation table, which you've configured before with a translate provider. And all it does is it replaces the translation ID with a concrete translation. So actually, there's no real replacing going on there, like a real replacement. It's just like, give me the translation ID, I look it up somewhere, and I give you the actual string. Boom, that's it. And that was all it was. And I called it Angie Translate, and I put it up on G+, and I posted it, and I said, hey guys, so this is the thing that I've just built, and maybe it's useful to you, maybe not, I don't know, but you can just use it right away. And then yeah, people checked it out, and they gave me feedback. They said, yeah, that's awesome. So you can now use translation IDs, and you get like real translations, but there was no way to change a language at runtime or anything. So this was just 1 language per build. All you got out of it is you have a template with those filter calls, and then you can bake this application with your templates with 1 specific language. And then you can do it with different languages, but you cannot change the language at runtime. So you need to decide that at build time, more or less, which was the problem that I needed to solve, and that was my solution. So, and yeah, it didn't take so long. So people came up with ideas, and they said, hey, wouldn't it be actually nice if there's a way to change the language at runtime so that it's really a translation thing? Because currently there's just only 1 language. And I said, yeah, sure, let's do it. I mean, I definitely want to do it. I haven't implemented yet. And so there were ideas coming up, and then I've very quickly implemented like a way to register more than 1 translation table, and then you could decide which language you want to use at runtime, and then you could change the language at runtime and everything. And I was constantly pushing updates to G+ and Twitter, and so that I was like releasing every 2 days or something, like a new version. And at some point, and I can remember this one, there was an issue popping up. It was issue number 4, I guess it was. You can check it out right now. And there's a there was a contributor. His GitHub handle is Knelly. Big shout outs to him, by the way, because currently he's a core member of the Angular Translate team. So he opened up this issue and he was like, hey, so cool, we have this filter now. We can now change the language at runtime, which is awesome, but wouldn't it be nice if we can load translation tables at runtime asynchronously? And I said, yeah, that's awesome. I want to do that. Let's discuss on that. So we had this issue with, like, I don't know, like so many, like many big discussions with big comments on there with ideas how we can do it, and we still needed to learn and understand the provider and service thing in Angular. So you can check out that issue. It was a big milestone in Angular Translate, and once that was implemented, it was actually it was a sort of killer feature. So you were able to provide your application with translation tables. You could change the language at runtime, and you could even load translation tables lazily. Yeah. So that was that thing, right? And yeah, and then it got bigger and bigger and bigger. There were a lot of users using it. I was invited to a meetup in Amsterdam by Carmen, who also organized the NGNL conference. And she invited me to speak there about that project, so it got more attention. And again, I was constantly pushing on G+ and Twitter with new releases and everything, and so there were a lot of early adopters and a lot of contributions. So there are so many features. You can check out the website. The documentation is actually available, I think, in 7 or 8 different languages.
Awesome.
It is awesome, and I haven't done that myself, right? So there were like a ton of contributions, and so whatever, when you take a look at Angular Translate right now as it is, it's pretty much filled with ideas that do not came from my mind. So there were like so many people that said, hey, wouldn't it be nice if we could do this, and wouldn't it be nice if we could do that? And that was my first real experience with working on a open source project and getting all that input from other people, because there were so many ideas that came up, and that was just awesome. So now Angular Translate is that big thing that is used by a lot of people, also by a lot of big companies. I'm very happy that it's like that, and I'm even more happy about it that there are so many contributors that help out. I have a team that is working on that. In fact, the last few months, I haven't done any releases. They were all done by the team. So it's cool, right? You have a community behind it, people who work on that, and there's still people that come to me and thank me for the nice module, which is awesome. But yeah, I just wanted to make sure that, just to make clear, Angular Translate is not a project that is just done by me. There are actually a lot of people behind it working on that, and yeah, so that's pretty much the story of Angular Translate.
Nice history, thank you. I'm actually looking at that issue number 4, and it's just chock full of like these different ideas, like, oh, maybe we should do this. Oh no, that like wouldn't work as this or whatever. Like, oh, cool example. Yeah, it's kind of fun to see those discussions, and I think GitHub makes that really easy and open, and I think that's a good thing. So anybody who's interested in contributing, obviously Pascal is very interested in helping people contribute and be involved in the project.
Right, and that actually in general. So whenever you want to contribute to something, just do it. So it doesn't have to be Angular Translate. Pick a project and contribute.
Yeah. I get a couple of first-time contributors on Angular formally, and they get so excited when, like, this is my first pull request and I got merged. Like, that's so cool.
I had the same at Angular Translate. So there was one contributor from Ukraine, and he was like, you know, Pascal, so you kind of contacted me via email or something, and he was like, you know, I do want to build this thing for Angular Translate, this kind of loader extension, but I really don't know how Angular works, and I have no experience with Git or GitHub. So I said, all right, that's pretty much an invitation. So I will help you making your first pull request. And now he's a core contributor to the project. So it's cool when you enable people contributing. That's cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. That's
Just
awesome.
to add to that, I think like though Pascal says you should contribute to any open source project, which is very great. But if you were picking one and you were interested in Angular Translate, go for it, because like you said, you don't know Git. Like he's like the friendliest guy. He like hook you up, help you do whatever, and you can then end up being the core contributor, like in that example. So.
That's right. You don't. There was this nice talk at NGConf. We don't need no stinking badges. So you don't need permission to be awesome. Just do something. Get in touch, and yeah.
That's great. So I did have a couple of questions about Angular Translate and maybe i18n in general. This takes a little bit of knowledge of how Angular Translate works, but basically, yeah, maybe you could give us a little bit of a backstory of how, or maybe not backstory, but like a short rundown of how Angular Translate works, and like the different ways that you can load translations and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, sure. So actually, it's super simple. So Angular Translate is in the end nothing more than just a sort of in-memory JSON storage. So what you do is you take the translate provider and you have very simple methods, and you call those methods and you use them to save translation tables. And a translation table is nothing more than a JSON or just a JavaScript object that has translation IDs, which are the keys, and you have translations, which are the values. So in your code, you would say something like in your config phase, translate provider dot translations as method, and then you just pass in an object. And you also specify a language key or your locale key. It's just a string, but you would use something like DE or EN for whatever language you use. So that you do with your languages, you just register your translation tables. You can do that statically. And so let's say you make that for two translation tables, DE and EN. And then in your templates, you can use the translate directive, for example, so as an attribute. And then you can say, I don't know, let's say you have a span element, and then you have a translate attribute, and you pass in a translation ID as value. And what Angular Translate does is it takes this translation ID and looks it up in the table. So it's pretty much a hash map. So you just get the translation of that particular translation ID. That's it. And then it lands in your DOM. You can also use a filter for that if you prefer that. And so this is the very the short version. And if you do want to change the language, what I do in Angular Translate is I basically use the binding system of Angular. So whenever, I mean, you just need to think about when, in what kind of situations is it possible that the language actually changes. It usually happens through user interaction, right? When the user says, all right, I changed the language from A to B. So, and what Angular does is when we have user interaction, so when we have events that are fired, for example, there's a digest cycle that is triggered. So all I need to do is when somebody says, I want to change the language from German to English, for example, there's a method on a translate service that you can inject. So all you have to do is you just say something like $translate.use, and then you give it a translation table key, a language key, which you've used for the registration. And that you just call during a ng click handler or whatever. And then the digest cycle is triggered, and then it would re-evaluate all the directives and the filters that you use, and which then in cause turns Angular Translate to look up the translation ID in the translation table again, but this time with the new language that you've chosen before. So it's just that. It's really just that. And the lazy loading is just a very, very simple extension. So if you change your language to if you change the language to a translation table that doesn't exist yet in your local in your memory yet, so if you haven't registered that before, what Angular Translate does is it uses a loader, a synchronous loader that you can configure. And so if you say, I change my language to English, then it says, okay, all right, I look it up in the English translation table. Oh, wait, there is no English translation table yet. So I use that loader and load that translation table. So a loader is basically nothing more than a AJAX request. That's just it. And you can specify what the endpoint of that loader is. And then you can say, all right, so if there's a translation table that is requested but not there yet, then please make an AJAX call and get it from there. And what you get back is a JSON, and then that one is stored. So it's pretty much the same thing that you do statically, but with an AJAX call. And then that one is used, which in turn means it's asynchronous, so I've used promises for that, and that makes everything asynchronous. But yeah, that's basically how it works. And everything else on features that you have in Angular Translate are just like little extensions that sit on top of that. For example, you can define fallback languages. So if you translate your application and Angular Translate tries to look up a translation ID that does not exist in your current translation table, then it would fall back to another translation table and looks it up there. So there are like tons of options, and in fact, you're not restricted to use just those kind of loaders and arrow handlers and whatever you can do there. You can build your own custom loaders, you can build your own custom storages and arrow handlers and everything. So there are like streamlined APIs. We give you tools and extensions that you can optionally install, so you don't get loaders, for example, by default. You have to install them explicitly and extend the framework. But you also have APIs to build your own custom things in case the stuff that we provide you don't fit your needs.
I think that's the mark of a well-thought-through library is one that builds hooks into being able to manipulate how it's used, and then dog foods and uses those own hooks to cover the common use cases.
Yeah, right.
So, yeah, that's awesome. So how do you, you talked a little bit, one of my questions was about modularity and how do you scale a big application. I think you kind of answered that with the asynchronous loading. Do you have any other comments on modularity? And because like I think the common case is somebody will have an i18n folder and they'll put en.json and an es.json and fr.json, whatever. And then you just say, load these asynchronously. And that works really well unless your application gets to be 150,000 lines of code, and that leads to a lot of translations you need. So how do you split that up so that the translations scale with the application?
Right. So, of course, first that depends on your application, right? So if it gets bigger, so I think you can really first start with something like that. So you just have a folder, i18n, where you put in some JSONs for each language. But in fact, it's right. You have a use case where it turns out that your application gets bigger and you do not want to load all translation data for the English language, where, for example, 80% of those translations are not actually used in the application because the user only comes across 2 submodules instead of 10 or whatever.
Or because it's such a big file that when we go to change something, we forget to remove it because it's just like...
Yeah, right. So we came across that problem as well, or rather the community came across that problem, so we responded to that. In fact, that is the feature that was implemented by Max from the Ukraine, who haven't done anything with Git and GitHub before. Big shout out to him as well. He implemented the partial loader, so you are able to define like a module-based pattern for your application, so that you can say, hey, please load the translation for the English language, but only for module X. And when the user comes across module Y, then load those translations. So it might make sense also to structure your translations like that you have translation files per language per module. But it really depends on your particular use case. I personally like it to have so things that belong together, like modules. We do the same with controllers and services and directives that belong together. We put them in one module and they're one feature, one package. Maybe we should also put all those translations that belong to that package in there. It might make sense. It depends on your particular use case. But I think that's the way to go then. You can partially load additional translations at runtime then. Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually what I've done. So because I use Webpack, I don't have to worry about like partial loading or anything, and it actually just gets loaded at build time, and then eventually I'll finally be able to look into Olivier's OC lazy load to load those things lazily after like as a part of each module, and it's actually pretty cool. One day maybe I should open source what I've done.
Yeah, you should do it.
Yeah, it's a good idea. Because, yeah, I think scaling a big application, anything like more than 15,000 lines of code, you got to start thinking about scaling it and modularizing things if you plan on it going anywhere and growing. And translations are no different. So it's cool that you guys have an answer for that now. So pluralization and gender, what is your answer to that?
Message from Matt. So for pluralization in general, there's already a standard out there which is called ICU message format, and it has a very, very big user base. They're already, so it's a actually it's a sort of programming independent solution, so it's a sort of specification, and there are implementations for different languages. So for example, there is a project out there called message format JS, which is a JavaScript implementation for the message format syntax. And it solves all the problems and possibilities that you can come across when it comes to pluralization and gender selection, and also nested things and everything. So Angular Translate does nothing more than it allows you to plug message format JS into the internationalization process of Angular Translate. So what you can do, you can say, all right, I do have cases where I need pluralization, so I can add a interpolation adapter for message format JS, and then you can load message format JS as you would just normally do. You would tell Angular Translate, hey, listen, please use that particular interpolation adapter, and then you can use message format. The thing why you need to specify the interpolation adapter is because message format is its own specification. It comes with its own language, like its own syntax. So the interpolation process is a bit different. So we know interpolations from Angular. We know the double curlies that we can use, and we can use filters in them. When you use something like a message format JS, you use single curlies, and there are no filters, so you don't have any Angular-specific functionality inside message format syntax. So that means you would lose all the stuff that you actually get from Angular in that case. And that's why I changed, or actually I extended the solution a little bit, that you can say, all right, please use that particular interpolation system as default. But in that case, where you have, for example, a DOM element that uses pluralization, there you can override the default interpolation system. So you would decide on a DOM level, this particular translation ID needs to use message format interpolation. You can read that up in the docs. But well, so in the end, it's just important to know that we did not reinvent the wheel. We used something that is already out there, and we just took the power from message format and put it into Angular Translate with a minimal amount of effort, basically. Yeah, and actually, this is something that will be built right into the core in Angular 1.4, and I think Chirayu can tell something about it.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. So perfect segue into i18n with Angular 1.4. So do you want to take that away, Chirayu?
Yeah, sure. So exactly what Pascal was saying, right? So one of the things is the ability to do pluralization and gender stuff and have that work with internationalization. Angular has had a bunch of other solutions like Pluralize and whatnot. They have their own limitations. You can't use Pluralize inside an attribute, for instance. But also, it's a custom solution, right? It's not just standard. And so Angular Translate already uses message format. But then you have the disconnect in the sense that you have to pick your interpolation provider. And it's not a fault of Angular Translate. It's just that Angular has its own incompatible interpolation syntax. I mean, incompatible in the sense these two things are born separately. Message format had no idea of Angular interpolation. Angular interpolation had no idea of message format. So you can't like mix and match them. So for 1.4, one of the things we did was like look at it and say we want to have a first-class pluralization support, and we also don't want it to be. We don't want to break existing Angular applications, right? So if you loaded an existing Angular template in a new version, we suddenly should not be interpreting certain symbols a different way. Right? Like if it was valid before, it should continue to be valid later as well. Like we shouldn't change anything. So what we've done is we've kind of, like I said, they're incompatible syntaxes, so you can't use them exactly the way they are. But we've extended the regular interpolation to support message format like syntax. So it's almost the same. The escape character is a backslash instead of a single quote. And instead of using single curlies for interpolation inside the message format messages, we use double curlies. I think that's pretty much it. Otherwise, it's more or less the same thing. And with that, message format becomes like a core supported interpolation syntax. It's just in there. It's a separate module in Angular 1.4, so you have to include, I think it's ng-message format.js or something.
Mm-hmm.
But if you include that in your top level application module, it depends on ng message format and its dependencies along with ng, right? Ng, I guess, is default. Then wherever you're using interpolation, it automatically supports message format. And by message format, I mean it's a subset of message format. It's stuff for plurals and gender. The key about this is in message format, anytime, all the syntax that message format supports, the way it works is you have a variable like gender, username, something, right? But then you have a comma after that, and you write like plural or select or whatever else it is. Now, this top-level comma would have been invalid in regular Angular parsing. So that's how the compatibility is maintained. In the sense, we saw the comma, we are like, okay, so you're parsing message format, and I can give you errors or not, and like deal with that. But if you didn't use the comma, then it's not message format. So there's no way that we're going to take an existing Angular application which worked correctly and misinterpret it. If it was already broken because it had a comma, so $parse is going to throw an error, then we might do something else, and it suddenly becomes valid, perhaps, if we had managed to type exactly message format. But that's kind of rare case.
Yeah, totally. And
it's a top-level citizen. Yeah.
Yeah, you shouldn't be relying on bugs. Don't rely on bugs.
Right. Yeah. But it had to. This has to be like an assorted bug where the bug like looks really like message format. It's just kind of hard to do. But yeah, so it's kind of well thought out for that to make sure it just seamlessly works. And the advantage of this is not only can you use this in attributes or anywhere interpolation works, but because it's a declarative syntax and we understand it, and message format has a whole nesting and everything, we can statically analyze and statically extract these messages. It's something like ng-pluralize, or if you're using ng-switch for gender, you can sort of try to statically extract these things for translation to send to a translator, but you can't be sure that it is really a gender expression or something else, because ng-switch is generic. You could have an and condition where you mix gender and something else, like age greater than 18 at the same time, all males greater than the age of 18. You could write an ng-switch like that, and there's no way we're going to extract something sensible for this translator. But if you're using message format, now you have to like structure it so that the gender test is separate from the age test, and we can extract just the gender part and send it in a translation file. And I should also point out that while message format is an ICU standard, it's not like a global standard. So one of the things is, how do you do translations for things which don't support ICU message format? And this is an interesting problem because some file formats, like if you look at getTextPO, it cannot do plurals. Like it just doesn't exist. So then you're looking at how do translation companies do translations where plurals are involved. And you know, it's a data-dependent plural. Like we don't know in advance it was a male or a female. Like it has to be selected upon by some data. And really, the best solution that we know of, like, is message format. That's why Pascal has it in Angular Translate, and that's why it's part of the Angular 1.4's interpolation syntax. But like, if we extract it into a file format, I know XMB and XTB support it because it's the ICU standard. But if you pick like getText or something else like that, and you were trying to extract it in the command line tools, which will come later, we would throw an error and saying, hey, like, does your translator understand the syntax? Like, we can extract it, but you know, they're not going to know how to deal with it. And so one of the things is to push adoption of a standard pluralization of gender syntax. It doesn't have to be message format. It's just the one we have right now, which has some support at least. So, like, you know, like to help adoption of some common syntax. Yeah.
Cool. I use message format and I love it. It's yeah, very good. And it's exciting to see Angular thinking more about internationalization built in. I think that's very cool. So now, Pascal, at the end of your guys' talk, you posted some slides on what's going to happen to Angular Translate. And so when I looked at those slides, I missed the last slide. I didn't see the last slide, so I thought that Igor was just being like a big jerk to you or something. I can stop
No.
doing this. So can you explain to our viewers who may not have seen that what that was all about?
Yeah, sure. So, right. So the idea behind that little tiny slide deck is just to actually introduce the whole story, like how that all started. That we are working on something real for Angular, and like, when it comes to internationalization. And it was just that I met Igor last year at NG Europe, the very first time in person, and so he came to me, and I mean we knew each other already, but he came to me and he said, yeah, so why are you doing this? And I was like, what do you mean? What are you talking about? And he was like, yeah, this Angular Translate thing. And I was like, why? And he was like, yeah, we were thinking about that too at Google, like building something and like something for internationalization, using bindings and everything, but for performance reasons, we said no, that's not a good idea. Um, and then all of a sudden there's this Pascal coming up and building Angular Translate, and everybody uses it. That's shitty. So could you please stop doing it? But it was more like a fun thing, right? So it was not that he was being a jerk or anything. It was more like a fun thing. And I told him, well, yeah, right, sure. I will just shut down the project on GitHub, and you'll see how you can handle the fan club.
Nice.
So that was it. It was like a sort of key moment that I saved to my brain. So I put it up on the slide deck. It's actually more a funny joke, and that's why you definitely should check out the last slide on that slide deck. Yeah, and maybe we can share that link to the slide deck later because
Sure.
the
Yeah, I'll put it in the show notes.
yeah, right. So just that everybody knows, Igor is not a jerk. He was actually the one who started that stuff and who came to me and wanted to talk to me about that stuff to make something really good. So yeah, kudos to that.
So that Igor.
Angular Translate is not going anywhere.
Right.
Yeah, that's the key.
Yeah, let's clear that now. Angular Translate's here to say. So because there's so much good coming in Angular 1.4 for internationalization, what does what value do I get out of Angular Translate that I don't get out of the core?
Okay. Yeah. So it again depends on your use case. Whereas Angular Translate is a fully client-side solution, because that was my personal problem back in the days. It is really just for client-side. The solution that comes to Angular 1.4 basically also works on the server side. So we give you tools to extract all the messages from your application so that you can generate new templates with new locales. But you can also use a client-side solution, which will be baked right into Angular, where you have a dynamic translation that is happening in a pre-compile step. So if you're currently using Angular Translate in your project and you're happy with it and you don't have any performance problems or anything, you can just stick with it. It's fine. But if you have a lot of translations and you have a real translator working on your translations, you want to be able to write your templates in just pure text without inventing something like translation IDs. And if you want to have first-class support by the actual Angular project, then I would consider migrating to the solution that we're building for it. Because the nice thing about the new solution that comes to the core is that it's a solution that lets you, so you're able to incrementally add that stuff to your existing application. So even if you use Angular Translate right now, you can start partially adding like the new solution to it, because all you need to do is you can just replace translation IDs again with concrete text, and those are the messages that get extracted. That doesn't mean that Angular Translate doesn't work anymore. It still works. So that's the nice thing about it. It depends on your use case in the end. If the solution for 1.4 is stable, I would in most cases prefer it, I guess. But it depends.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Because a little bit. So everything that Pascal said, basically, right? And the last part where it says once it's stable, right? And here's the part, like the Angular 1.4 support, like message format is a core part of the of Angular, so it's shipping with it. But the dynamic client-side only version is probably not going to be in 1.4. It'll probably be in 1.5. So the server-side version will probably be working with 1.4 because the development for that happens in parallel. It won't be tied to 1.4. The command line, they have their own lifecycle. But until they're all stable and hit their 1.0, Angular Translate, I would think, is still like what you should be using for production. And once we can say, yeah, this is the full end-to-end solution for this is ready and working, which would probably be Angular 1.5. At that point, you can do your hello world and all this stuff. Say, yeah, this works for me. I like all this stuff I have. And yeah.
Right. And there are actually still some features that probably won't land into the solution that Angular 1.4 will support. For example, things like fallback languages. I don't think there is any consideration on that currently because, again, the solution that comes to Angular 1.4 is not really a 100% client-side solution. So even if you change the language at runtime, you don't really change it at runtime. When you change the language on the client side, you will always cause a page reload, which you don't have in Angular Translate. So if you do not want to have this page reload for whatever reason, I needed it back in the days, then you want to stick with Angular Translate. And also, yeah, things like local negotiation and fallback languages and everything. So those are things that maybe don't even make sense in that particular solution for the Angular 1.4 release.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's it. I just wanted to touch upon that a little bit more to say that in the new solution, something that will always be the case and be different from Angular Translate probably is that application, it's either a reload or a reinitialization. You don't have reload. The top level app components will all be like the scopes will be destroyed and recreated. And part of this is because there's two ways to do it, right? If you do not want to destroy anything, then you have to keep track of all the dependencies that have a change, all the messages, all the functions, closures, everything, that when a locale changes, you had to go fix them all up. But this adds extra memory pressure and makes you have the equivalent of Angular watches. You can try and make them efficient, but there's still overhead. But the overhead is there only for the time when you do switch locales. And when we think about it, it seems that most of the time, if you're switching locales, you didn't understand what was there in the first place. I mean, there are limited use cases for when you want to switch it on the fly and you understand both languages or something. But often it isn't the case. So the memory overhead and the runtime overhead of keeping track of it seems not to be worth it. So the Angular 1.4 and future solution basically reinitializes your application, or top-level component, whichever that one is, when you switch locales. So some cases are, when someone says, well, I started filling out this form, and then I realized I need to switch languages, that I'm going to lose my data. So there are cases like that, and I'm not really convinced that's a really strong use case. It is a use case, and you should use Angular Translate for those things. The thing is, if you were able to fill out half the form, you understand enough to save a draft version of the form. And if the application doesn't support saving an intermediate state or doesn't autosave or anything, then it doesn't even matter whether you're internationalized. You have bigger problems. The small network connectivity could just kill everything you typed. So I think the usual problems that are put up for this tend to have other problems as well. There are ways of solving it which will make it not be an issue if you reload. But that's my take on it. If there's any specific things that really, really bother people, you should let us vote now.
I think that I'm excited about what's coming, and I wish that we had a little bit more time because I kind of wanted to touch on whether there's a solution or whether there's any thoughts on a solution for Angular 2. But I don't think that we have time to cover that. So I'm sure.
Yeah, we have time. It's a one-liner. So the answer is yes. It's going to be one solution for all the Angulars: Angular 1, JS, Dart, and Angular 2, JS and Dart. So the command line tools are being written in their own separate repository.
Deliveries included.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Hey, we had time. Perfect. Okay, so we're going to wrap this up. We have just a couple of questions, and then we'll ask our new developer tips. So first, actually, both of these are from Olivier Kuhn. He's probably Show's biggest fan, or at least he's the biggest question asker. It's really good questions. So the first question is, why do you think that Angular Translate is a semi-official demo library for toxic conferences? Is stroking your ego a little bit?
Oh, I think I didn't really get that question. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, so why do you think that Angular Translate is a semi-official demo library for toxic conferences?
What are toxic conferences?
I don't know. Maybe there are some toxic conferences you don't know about, but but I think yeah, maybe I don't totally understand this either. But like what at NGNL, for example,
Yeah.
you had like everybody mentioned Angular Translate in their talk.
Oh,
Almost.
right, yeah.
So
Yeah,
why do you think it's so like everybody knows what Angular Translate is? I mean, you kind of covered this at the beginning, but how did it get to be so popular, I guess?
okay, so first I think your microphone is just broken because it was making weird sounds. But
Sorry.
maybe, yeah, it's weird. I don't know. I think it was nice that people were mentioning it at the NGNL conference. I'm happy that there's this adoption. I'm not sure if it's a semi demo thing. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's just nice.
Cool. Okay, you can. How's my mic? Is that better?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Yeah, Olivia, you can reach out to Pascal if we didn't catch your.
Yeah, please ping me on Twitter. I think I just didn't get the question right.
Okay. So this is an interesting question. Do you know of any good tools that extract strings to translate from your code? So like in my HTML, is there a tool that will look for strings in my HTML that says, hey, you need to translate this?
Is that particular for Angular Translate or for the 1.4 solution? We can. I think we can answer both. So there are grunt tasks for Angular Translate specifically. So under the Angular Translate organization on GitHub, so github.com/AngularTranslate, there's a I think grunt Angular Translate project, and it's a grunt plugin which extracts all the translation IDs from the templates in order to match them with existing translation tables, so that you can find out if they're missing translations or not. And yeah, I think Chirayu can say something about the extraction tool for the 1.4 solution.
Oh, sure, yeah. So for 1.4, that's it's a part of the design. In the sense, for 1.4, what we said, like what Pascal was saying, the incremental, right? So you just write HTML. You don't even know that you wanted to internationalize it. And then you realize, oh, I want to internationalize this. So an example, which this is thanks to Igor, actually, because he pointed that out. So it's now become my canonical example in Pascal, like we talked about it. It's like you have input placeholder equals, enter your name here. Now placeholder equals enter your name here, that part clearly has to be translated. But you don't even have to tell us about it, and you don't need to tell the translator this is the placeholder of input tag, because you can infer all that stuff. And so the extraction pipeline automatically does that. The prototype we have actually does that right now, where it says, oh, here's an input, it's a placeholder, we're going to extract it this way. And it's actually pluggable because it's not going to be hard-coded. It's going to ship with HTML5 definitions. But you can also add your own definitions, saying, hey, I have all these directives. Anytime you have this attribute, this needs to be extracted, that shouldn't. You can have rules like that. You can override all these, like the design doc basically calls out how on every node you can say this attribute is this attribute is that, whatnot. But without having to type all that stuff, that's there. And the solution really depends upon extracting messages from HTML. Now, it won't extract messages from JavaScript or anything, but the solution is specifically for HTML. So in all your Angular templates, if there's anything that needed to be translated, the idea is that the tool will figure it out and extract it, or give you a warning if you did something wrong there, or did not mark it up, or did not give enough context and stuff.
Cool. Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Great. That's our questions. Then we just have one last question, and then I have one other thing that I want to say before we depart. So the question is, what tip would you give a brand new developer? So we'll start with Pascal. Do you have a tip?
Yeah. So I think as a developer, there's one book that you need to read, which is called The Pragmatic Programmer. It's written by Uncle Bob, and it's very old, but it's full of good stuff. And when you read it today, the stuff that is written down there still applies to the world of today. And it makes you a better developer. It makes you write tests. It makes you write good code and everything. So you should read that one. And also another thing, please don't think that people that build cool stuff are unreachable. Just be part of the thing. Whenever you want to do something, whenever you want to build something, or whenever you want to contribute to something, just do it. Reach out to the people, ask them how you can help, ask them if the idea that you have is an idea that they might that they want to consider or not, and just don't hesitate to just be part of it. There's nothing special about people that build things like Angular Translate or Angular Formally or Angular Lazy Load or whatever. You are like a human like everybody else. Yeah, that's what I want to say.
Awesome tips. Thanks. Chirayu.
Tips. I'm not sure I can think of any. Like as a beginning developer, right? Like I look back on when I was a beginning developer, but that was like 20 years ago. Like I was a little kid, right? But I think in general, a part of it is to say, don't get too hung up on like the real software engineering philosophies and stuff, like I mean code style or something else, right? Like those will come later. If it's just really beginning and you don't have anything, just go explore. Like I want to try that. I believe you can do that. It doesn't matter how that happens. You want to hook up like an Android debugger to something and do then an Arduino or something. Hook it up, right? Okay, maybe there's a little hardware, but it's the same thing with software. Hook it up, write your own command line utilities. It'll suck, but now you learn flag parsing or you learn all these nuances. You like have this amazing tool set over time, and you'll start then noticing on your own without somebody telling you, structure your code this way. You're like, oh yeah, I can totally see the benefit. My code looks like a mess right now or something. But it doesn't matter. Like that's how you write it. Like I was telling Pascal, like my MRC or whatever, like it's like insanely long, but it's like copy pasted and it's like a mess. It does its stuff though, and then you learn a lot during that process. And you can like even the best software projects like I worked on, we rewrite it later, or like there's a second version of it, there's a third version, just because the first version sucked. So never let that be like getting in your way, but just go try things out. And these days it's so easy to go try things out. Like so many resources, like Pascal was saying, just reach for help. IRC or like ping somebody on Twitter or something. And with GitHub, it's amazing. Just clone a repository. They won't let us stop you. Like try it out. There's probably someone out there who's also like learning it and experiencing the same problems, and you can get in touch with them.
Great. And my tip for the week is to be nice. I think that it's and normally oh, my lights went out again. 1 second. Okay. Normally I found that newcomers are generally very nice, but I think it's just really important for you to like when you ask people for help. It's just important to be understanding that lots of the time they're helping you during their personal time. But don't let that scare you from asking for help, because people want to help, and if they don't, somebody else will. And so yeah, just be kind, and we're all trying to just live life and do the best that we can. So
especially in the Angular community, I guess.
Yeah, I found Angular guys are super and gals are super awesome. So
yeah.
Okay, so I have one other last thing that I would like to do before we wrap this up, and that is today is a special day for Pascal.
I forgot it already. Once again.
No, you're celebrating.
Oh no, it stopped.
Yes, it's Pascal's birthday. Happy birthday, Pascal.
Happy
Thank
birthday.
you very much. Thank you very, very much. So much appreciated.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
So, yeah, that's that. I'm not going to ask you how old you are. You can volunteer that information if you want to.
24.
24. Holy cow, you baby.
Yeah, a little kid.
I have a beard. I'm not a baby anymore.
That's why he has the beard, to show that.
Right.
Cool, guys. Well, hey, thank you so much for being on the show. Really appreciate it. Is there anything that you'd like to say before we close up?
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for making this Angular Air thing, because I think it's awesome. And yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah, basically, thanks for hosting. This was really nice.
Great.
Yeah.
yeah, I've had a lot of fun doing it. I'm glad that you guys came on. Hopefully, people learned something about caring about their users from this video broadcast. Yeah, we'll just sign off for now and see everybody next week. Bye, bye, guys.
Bye bye. Thank you.
Bye.